After 20 years of hiring for hedge funds globally, I've seen extremely capable people fail to get in, and it's rarely for the reasons that you think. So let's get into it. So I have been hiring for many, many years for hedge funds and investment banks, and I've done so in some of the world's top financial centers in London, in New York, in Asia, etc. And the thing that I've noticed in that time is that hedge funds tend to be opaque by design. If you're not in the industry or if you don't have proximity to somebody who's in the industry, it's very difficult to really kind of understand how they operate and what you need to do to be able to get in. And a lot of times they'll advertise roles, especially the larger ones, they'll advertise roles, but it tends to be, relatively speaking, generalist information. Oftentimes, if a hedge fund advertises for, say, 10 roles, they may have 20, 50 roles available. They just don't necessarily want to share all of that information in the public domain. So it means that as the person with an interest in getting into a hedge fund, you're operating with not a lot of information. You lack context in being able to sort of navigate your search. Um, in my time of hiring, I've hired across all levels, from juniors all the way through to senior people, C-level professionals, from engineering all the way through to quantitative research and quantitative trading and portfolio management. And so in this video, I don't necessarily want to talk about tactics per se. I don't want to talk about resume or CV formatting or networking scripts. What I want to focus on is on alignment, awareness, and giving more context as to how hedge funds actually work and how they hire. So that if you're somebody who is trying to position yourself to work within a hedge fund, then you have a sense of what you need to do to be able to navigate these sort of searches. So there are a few things to kind of understand is that hedge funds tend to operate with various degrees of structure. And the levels of structure they operate with really depends on kind of their size and where they are in terms of their stage of evolution. So you'll typically find that the larger hedge funds, and they're larger relatively speaking, they're not as large as investment banks. We're talking of a few thousand people here on the large side. So the larger hedge funds will tend to have a bit more structure, and the smaller hedge funds will typically have less structure. They've got more flexibility to be able to sort of navigate their hiring and their searches. For the large multi-strategy platforms, your millenniums, your citadels, the 72s of this world, they tend to have structured hiring programs, structured hiring process, etc. For some of the smaller ones, then they're not as structured. I would say they're semi-structured in terms of how they navigate their searches. And I'm referring here to the 50, 100, 200 person hedge fund as a smaller hedge fund. So oftentimes people think that hedge funds only hire the best of the best, and there is definitely a truth to that. You definitely have to be at the top of your game to be considered by and hired by a hedge fund, but that's not all there is to it. Hedge funds actually want to hire people that exhibit the least amount of risk. You're dealing in a company that, sort of works with a lot of money, there's a lot at stake. And so a lot of the interview process, on one hand, is about establishing your expertise and your skill set. On the other hand, it's about understanding the level of risk you've shown up with and sort of estimating how risky of a hire you'll be. It's not just about, when I talk about risk, I'm not just talking about, whether you'll be somebody that's safe to hire or not. Is that if, for example, you're not the right cultural fit for a team or 5, 10 people in a 50-man firm, that you can have a significant impact on, the well-being of the rest of the team, of the culture, on the culture of the rest of the team. And so the sort of cost of bringing in the wrong hire then not only impacts that specific person and the work that you brought them in to do, but it impacts the rest of the company at large. So the process of de-risking is a very, very important process. So let's talk a little bit about the pathways to hedge funds. If you're somebody that is outside of hedge funds and you've been intrigued by it and you're thinking, well, what are my options of being able to kind of get in here? I want to talk about four key paths. The first is the direct experience pathway. So this is the cleanest pathway where you already work within a hedge fund and you're looking to move to another one. So this pathway tends to work very well for either junior profiles or people who've only ever worked within hedge funds. And so it's very kind of straightforward to ascertain what it is you've done, what asset classes you've worked on, what sort of trading systems you've worked on, whether, there parallel lines to be drawn between what you've done and what the prospective new firm is looking to do. So that tends to be very kind of straightforward. If you're on the junior side, sort of 0 to 3 years, you tend to be hired for your potential, your trajectory. You don't necessarily need to be the most polished person. If you're a bit more senior, then, not only do you need to know your stuff, but the emphasis is also on your judgment. So those are two key things that you tend to look for. So that's pretty straightforward, which is why I covered that first. The second pathway to get into a hedge fund is if you're working in adjacent institutions. So for a lot of people, this will be people who are currently working in investment banks, or you're working in proprietary trading firms or market makers, or you're working within technology, the big technology firms, the Googles, the Metas, etc. Those companies tend to be a good sort of training ground for infrastructure engineers within hedge funds. And so the key thing that makes you relevant if you're within an adjacent institution is that you've already been trained in a very relevant skill set. And within this kind of skill set, you can basically transfer it to working within a hedge fund. Another kind of adjacent pathway here is if you're working within vendor or data companies. So, for example, if you're looking to go into a hedge fund and you work at Bloomberg, or you work for a trading systems vendor, for example, that's another pathway as well, because you're working on something that is directly relevant to the hedge fund industry and potentially your skills could be applicable. I would say that the common mistake that people tend to make here when they work in adjacent institutions is that one, they're so hung up on titles. So I see this a lot with people coming from investment banking, and they'll say stuff like, I'm a VP or I'm a director, executive director at this bank. So I'd be looking for a relevant title. The reality is that a lot of hedge funds aren't caught up on title. It's, the focus is on how much value you're adding to the business and what part of the business you're kind of responsible for. So you have people who are quite senior who aren't necessarily leading people, but they're leading streams of work. Or you'll have people who are individual contributors, but they're making more than managers of other departments. So don't be hung up on title. And if title is something that really matters to you, you probably want to go work for a larger fund. Or if not, you probably want to stay in your industry where titles are recognized. So, titles don't tend to matter as much, I'd say. The other thing that I see when people are coming in from adjacent industries is they think, oh my gosh, I'm going to be moving into a hedge fund. This is an opportunity to double my base, triple my base, quadruple my base. And oftentimes I need to really kind of invest in educating people and saying, listen, the key thing here is about in the hedge fund land, we think about total compensation. It's not just about your base, it's about your base and your bonus. And there's an element of risk that you do take on in kind of having your compensation structured that way. But that is the business. When you're going into a hedge fund, you're entering into the business of risk, financial risk. So, it is what it is. And I think that this is something that often means that a lot of people set way high expectations when it comes to what their base will be without really realizing that actually the emphasis is on total compensation. So just something to be aware of if you're considering moving into a hedge fund. The third pathway is the academic or the research route. So if you've gone on to do a PhD or a postdoc, or you're currently in academia or some kind of research institute, then this is the pathway into hedge funds, particularly into quant funds. Quant funds love deep thinkers. They love people who can model complex systems, test hypotheses rigorously, and communicate their findings really clearly. And they like people who understand that their job is to be curious, to explore, and within a hedge fund, they can really kind of transfer those skills there. Hedge funds really want to for people who can add value and apply their judgment. They want people who can take insights and turn it into trades. And so people who have the ability to, do research and have good judgment tend to do quite well. The thing to remember here is not being caught up in the purity of your research work. You need to have a bias for action, and you need to be able to translate a research idea into something that could be implemented. So just something to be aware of if you're coming from an academic background or PhD, and you're interested in moving into a hedge fund. The fourth pathway that I see are people who come from non-quant and platform roles. So this is the path that a lot of people tend to overlook, and this is the pathway that probably has some of the biggest opportunities. And so I'm talking about, at this point, I'm talking not necessarily about quants and engineers, because those tend to be the sort of obvious pathways into hedge funds. I'm talking about areas like legal, compliance, HR, recruiting, operations, investor relations, even infrastructure in technology. Hedge funds need these people, but oftentimes people kind of rule themselves out. And you do need to be exceptional at what you do to be considered to working in these hedge funds. So I would say that there are two things that you need to demonstrate simultaneously. The first is unusual depth in your specific domain. So not just, for example, you being good at compliance, you need to really understand compliance in detail. You need to understand, I don't know, regulatory arbitrage, cross-border structuring, how funds actually need to operate under pressure. And then on the other hand, in addition to having unusual depth, you need to have enough breadth to make intelligent commercial decisions. So in this example, you need to understand, P&L, how investment decisions get made. You need to speak the language that is being spoken, with research or with trading within hedge funds. So you need to be able to have a bit of depth in your domain, specific depth, unusual depth, and also have breadth of knowledge across your domain. So I would say that those are the two key things that are really important. Oftentimes, you'll see people who have just the right amount of depth, but there's nothing to separate them from someone else with similar amount of experience. You need to have significantly more depth than the peers in your industry. And that might mean that you're doing a bit of reading, doing a bit of research, you're listening to podcasts, whatever it might be that you're listening to. You need to just kind of ensure that you know more than the average person. You need to know what's happening in the news, what's sort of coming up in terms of your area from a legal perspective, from a tech AI perspective, whatever it might be. But you need to be able to talk at length about it and really kind of understand things beyond a superficial level. So I hope that's helped. Those are the kind of four pathways that I typically see people making the transition into hedge funds. So let's talk a little bit about what gets you hired beyond your CV or resume. So let's say, you've identified yourself on one of or two of those pathways and you think, oh, great, I actually have some of the skill sets that Ada's been talking about, and I think I'll be able to get myself in there. I've come up with a great resume. let's talk about some of the things that you need to be aware of beyond your technical skills. And I don't want to gloss over the importance of technical skills in your specific domain because that's clearly very, very important. It really matters. You need to really know your stuff. But I want to go on to stuff that I feel isn't often talked enough about and really kind of makes a difference. And I see people who are brilliant technically struggle with this because they just don't understand why they're not making it through when they feel that they're the best technically in their field. The first thing I'd say that is often not spoken about, and hedge funds won't communicate this to you because they can't, because you might want to sue them. So the first thing I'd say is culture fit, right? So one of the reasons why people, one of the things that hedge funds will look at beyond your resume is culture fit. I think that this can go both ways, right? Because sometimes companies say culture fit to mean you're not like me, right? And I think that that can be dangerous because that means that building a monolithic company and you're not giving yourself the opportunity to bring in different people. So there's work to be done around interview criteria, the kind of questions to ask, education for interviewers, so that they really kind of understand what they're looking for and they're aware of their own biases and they can confront their own biases when they're interviewing people. But that's a topic for another day that I cover. I'll probably cover in a later video. When I say culture fit, the key thing I think that when it's done well, the key things that hedge funds look for is how does this person work? How do they communicate? How would they possibly deal with issues? Because all of those things are really the culture. People often tend to look at the softer, nicer things when it comes to culture, but a key component of cultural fit is actually how do you do your work? And so a lot of them will want people who are communicative when things are going well, communicative when things aren't going well, open to new ideas, but also have a very firm sense of your own ideas. And so I think if you're somebody who is essentially reasonable and someone who they look at and they think, I would want to work with this person. I can trust this person with sensitive information because in a hedge fund, you're typically dealing with a lot of sensitive information. So if they can answer yes to some of these things, then you would have passed the cultural fit test. What ideally they're not kind of looking at is, did this person go to the same school as me, or are they the same gender or race, or could I play football with them? Inevitably, human beings have bias, and there's definitely that, but that's not what I'm speaking of here. The second thing that hedge funds look at beyond resume is self-awareness. So can you really kind of look at yourself and articulate what you're good at? And not in a braggadocious way, but just in a kind of factual way and in a confident way. Can you articulate what you're good at? And are you aware of what you're not good at? Can you explain why you made a mistake and what you learned from that mistake? And can you admit when you don't know something or when you're wrong? This is an area that I see so many people fail down on, where if something goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault. It's their boss's fault, it's their colleague's fault, it's their mom's fault, it's their dad's fault. And that, for me personally, that shows a lack of emotional maturity. And I really love it when people are able to say, you know what, back in the day, this is how I did things, this is what I learned, these are the mistakes I made, this is how I've evolved. Because the reality is that a lot of your evolution will happen when you've made mistakes, right? So just somebody who's been able to articulate it in a way where I'm not saying throw yourself under the bus. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to communicate this to a prospective employer, right? So I understand that, you may not necessarily want to convey everything, but just be strategic about it and really kind of think about how you can show your evolution if you do get in front of these hedge funds and you're having a conversation. I think it's a way of them seeing that you can be honest with yourself without your ego coming under siege, and that you can really be trusted with risk and you can handle being wrong, and moving on, right? It's not something you dwell on or you're seeking revenge or you don't want to work with that team or whatever. You can basically handle it and you can move on. The last thing I'd say is that hedge funds tend to look for beyond your technical skills, because I think that that's a meaty subject for another video, is really your personal evolution. So, how do you adapt to things? How do you handle ambiguity? What have you done to really invest in yourself personally? Are you aware of where your strengths lie, where your weaknesses lie? What are you doing to deal with that? And this isn't about focusing on your weaknesses and trying to bring that up, because I think there's schools of thought that say that ideally you should be doubling down on your strengths to be absolutely brilliant at that rather than worrying about your weaknesses. But, I think ultimately, if you're somebody who, for example, is in mid-career and you're considering making the transition, you need to basically show that you've evolved. I think that the mistake I see a lot of people making is that they tend to be passive observers to their own careers. And every move that they make is as a result of something else happening outside of them. So, for example, they were made redundant. That's why they left this job. Their boss moved on. That's why they left this other job. Their boss asked them to join them in a new company. That's why they left that job. Now, inevitably, for some people, that is their story, that is their pathway. I'm not knocking it. I am just saying that hedge funds like it when people are always thinking about how to evolve themselves, how to move forward. They're being very thoughtful and intentional about what the next step is going to look like and why that's important and how to strategically navigate in that direction. That kind of mindset conveys a lot about how you navigate your work and how you approach your work. Are you somebody who's passive and just kind of waits for, people to come and tell you it's time to do this or you should look into that? Or are you somebody who basically surveys the work that you have to do and figures out a way to constantly iterate, evolve, and optimize what you're doing? So I think those things tend to show a lot more about how you operate than people think. And because a lot of people tend to focus a lot on their technical ability, which is the crux of most interviews, right? But just be aware that other things are being assessed at the same time as well, even if not necessarily explicitly stated. So let's pull all of this together and talk a little bit about why some candidates fail, even very, very strong people fail when they come to interview or try to get into hedge funds. I think it's important to kind of understand this and I think a lot of people tend to misunderstand what interviews are testing. So the first thing I'd say, reason why people don't tend to do well, smart people don't tend to do well with hedge funds is they keep things too high level without enough depth. And they speak in generalities. So, they might say, oh, I led a team or I managed a portfolio without really giving context about, the asset class, the trading frequencies, the Sharpe ratios, all of those things that basically show that you know your stuff and that you were actually the one working on it and it wasn't your colleague working on it and you got to observe and you're now sort of co-opting it as your work. And so, I think that having that um, having the ability to be able to know when to go deep and to explain the depth of your work and where to be high level is really an important technique. And it tends to play very well when you're speaking to hedge funds because you give them the confidence that you know your stuff, right? And you've got a bag of tools that you can sort of reference when it comes to doing your work. And you're somebody who can think laterally, so I think that that's really important. The second thing I would say that people tend to get wrong when they're trying to get into hedge funds is that they tend to be too much in the weeds and don't do enough big picture thinking. And the reality is that you kind of need both. You need both. You need depth, you need context, you need mechanics, you need meaning. You need to be able to do both things. You can ask somebody a simple question about, how did you do X? And then they start going into the theory and start going into the mechanics and start going into the detail. And you're like, no, if you're not able to explain very complex concepts in a simple way and adapt it for your audience, then that's a failure, right? About how you communicate. Oftentimes people think, I don't know, communication is about having the best words and not saying ums and ahs and having enough flourishes on what you're saying. But it's really about how well do you understand the crux of the problem and how well are you able to come up with a solution and translate that solution depending on the audience that you're speaking to, technical versus non-technical people. And then how do you carry those people through the length of the project that you're working on, the frequency of communication, knowing what to communicate to keep people abreast, to know when to bring people in, and to know when to tell people, don't worry about it, I got it, all the way through to the end. So I think that that's something else that people need to be better at communicating. The third thing, and I mentioned this earlier, but I really want to emphasize it, is when people are so hung up on titles. Again, as somebody who's moved quite a lot of people from banks to hedge funds, I see this most with people from banks. You don't see it as much with people coming from, big tech or other type of adjacent industries. But when people are coming from banks, and I understand it, I don't want to, I don't want to kind of make light of it. With banks being such large environments, the titles are important because they basically are a way of demonstrating your progress and trajectory through the organization. When you come into a hedge fund, those things don't matter as much. They are important, and depending on the size of the hedge fund, you do need some form of organization, and there is an element of hierarchy, right? However flat an organization wants to be, you do need some form of hierarchy so that things don't just kind of descend into chaos. But, having a title doesn't necessarily convey that you're better than anybody else. It doesn't necessarily mean that you earn more than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're in all the rooms you'd like to be in. So yes, it's important, but don't be hung up on it. The other thing I'd say that people get wrong when they're interested in getting to hedge funds is that they can only articulate what is within their remit. So the number of times I've spoken to people who can tell you what they do with their job, but they can't really connect it to the bigger picture of why it matters to the business, and they can't really articulate how their role and what they've accomplished has impacted the business. For a lot of people, it's either made money, it's saved money, it's sped things up, whatever it might be. People aren't able to connect the dots. And when you're not able to connect the dots, that's definitely a red flag, if not an amber flag. If you've worked in a company for a number of years, you need to be able to talk about what's happening with the company in terms of the bottom line, the key things that have evolved in the company, how your role fits into that, etc. So, I think that that's an important area that oftentimes people get wrong and don't get stuck into. The last one, and if you're somebody I've worked with, I beat the drum about this all the time because I think it's so important. The last thing is you've got to always have questions for your interviewers. I don't care if your interviewer has half of the number of years of experience that you have, or you've spoken to 8 people and you've run out of questions. Questions are one of the key ways that demonstrate, one, your enthusiasm for the role and company, two, how you think, and three, what matters to you. And oftentimes people treat these questions as a way to get information. And yes, used intelligently, they're definitely a way to get information. But understand that the questions you ask are also being assessed, and they convey the 3 things that I talked about earlier: your enthusiasm for the role and the company, how you think, and what matters to you. And people don't realize this enough. And so you can tell when somebody's just thinking of a question off the cuff. And I'm thinking, you've known about this interview for a week. You didn't have 30 minutes to come up with questions. You didn't do any bit of extra research to come up with questions. There's stuff in the news about the company you're interviewing with right now. Why do you not have any questions about that? So you've got to really kind of use questions in a strategic way. Another trick that I have, and I'll go, I have different videos that I'll do about interview techniques that I don't often see around. Another thing that people don't often do when it comes to interviews is I like it when people ask similar questions to different people, especially if they're at different levels, so if they're in different departments, because I like to see how different, parts of the business or how different people articulate certain things. And I think that doing so gives you a rounder picture of the company that you're getting into. But that's a story for another day, but just a thought while we're here. So let's kind of recap on where we are so far. We've talked a little bit about the different pathways of getting into hedge funds, what hedge funds look at beyond your resume, and the things that people typically get wrong when they're interviewing with or speaking to hedge funds. And so they're things that you need to really kind of be conscious of. Where I want to take this now is I want to talk a little bit about how you judge and assess hedge funds and how you kind of figure out which hedge funds you want to work for. The thing to note here is, and I'll probably add this to a common mistake that people make, is that the more famous a hedge fund is, the more people want to work for that hedge fund. And the less famous a hedge fund is, the less people want to work for that hedge fund. I'm here to tell you that if a hedge fund isn't well known and you don't see a lot about them on the internet or on the news or whatever, understand that this is very deliberate. And this is often a result of the principles of the company deciding that they want publicity or they don't want publicity. So if you're always seeing a founder or a CEO, the C-level executives of a hedge fund on LinkedIn, very prominent, on all the sort of financial media, know that that is part of their strategy. And oftentimes that strategy helps with attracting talent and attracting investors. If you're a prop firm and you don't necessarily need external investors, it reduces the importance of publicity and visibility. But that has no bearing on success. So I just want to really emphasize this. I see this often where people say, I want to work for the top tier firms, so I want to work for the well-known firms. And then I'm like, okay, well, what other criteria do you have? Because if you're looking for a successful company where you have autonomy, where you have the resources that you need, flat structure, all of those things, doesn't necessarily mean the most famous names. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So just something to be aware of. Um, I would say that when you're thinking of the sort of hedge funds that you're interested in working for, really pay attention to how they present themselves publicly. What words are they using? What sort of themes come up time and time again? Because that gives you a sense of what this company really cares about. Um, I would say that you want to go deep, not necessarily wide. So you want to have a selection of funds that you're interested in, and you want to go in depth with your research as much as possible. The other thing I will say is that you want to be in their ecosystem, right? So if you're not listening to podcasts already or reading books or following certain companies on LinkedIn, do all of these things, because I think the more you're in their ecosystem, the more you'll get to kind of understand how they speak, the more you'll understand what matters to them, and the more equipped you'll be at positioning yourself when you're ready to sort of make a move to try to get in there. And then the other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to getting into hedge funds is that the more proactive you are, the more effective your overall strategy is. Because you've got to understand that I mentioned at the top of the video, a lot of hedge funds won't necessarily advertise all of their roles. And they may work with some recruiters, but really, that's a gamble, right? You might be, in contact with a recruiting company that's really good, or with a recruitment agent that's really good, or you might come into contact with one that doesn't really have proximity to the hiring managers and so doesn't really understand the business and can't really give you the context that you need to enable you to prepare really well. So I think that being part of the ecosystem is important. The other thing I'd say is that if you somehow know somebody who has worked in a hedge fund you're interested in, it doesn't matter how tenuous the link. try to find a way to see if you can connect with them. It's typically straightforward on LinkedIn. Reach out to them, see if you can buy them a coffee and have a conversation and just ask about their experience. Each hedge fund is so different that even that 30 minutes or an hour that you spend with that person can really shed a lot of light. And this is stuff that you won't necessarily see in the public domain, and a recruiter might not have access to that information. So that puts you in a really good position to be able to get this. So if it's someone you go to the gym with, or somebody who goes to your church, or whatever, your sister's husband's best friend from college, it doesn't matter. However tenuous the link, grab a coffee, buy them a coffee, buy them lunch, and have a conversation and really kind of get some context. However distant the connection, however indirect the connection might be. I would say that when you're talking to these people, do your research and be very pointed and specific about the information that you're asking for. Just bear in mind that a lot of them have signed NDAs, so they may not be able to convey specific stuff, but at least they'll give you some context. The last point I want to kind of make is, if you're somebody who has an interest in working for hedge funds, I would say that you've got to understand that the hiring cycles don't necessarily, sometimes they can be fast. It depends if you happen to stumble upon a role that is directly relevant to your skill set and the company's, actively hiring. That process typically goes quickly. If you're going into some of the smaller firms that tend to hire more opportunistically, these processes tend to drag on a bit longer. Sometimes it'll take 3 months, 6 months. The more senior you are, it might even take a long time. So just bear that in mind, and just understand, I'm a believer that what's meant for you will always kind of get to you. So just use the time in between to do your research and speak to people and make sure that you have an understanding of the kind of specific companies that you're interested in over time. So I hope with this video you've seen that there isn't necessarily one key path to hedge funds or a right path to hedge funds. There are multiple pathways. And, the key thing is kind of just understanding what the likely pathways are for you and what levers you need to pull to be able to sort of navigate into hedge funds. What you need to kind of take the time in understanding is how they hire, what they value, what signals risk, what signals capability, so that you're in a position where you can really frame your skills in the right way and frame your experience in the right way. As much as is possible, I don't think it's worth optimizing for titles. I think the focus tends to be on judgment, on depth, on context. And if you start thinking of yourself as somebody who is there to solve problems that the fund needs solved, rather than a candidate that needs to be hired, I think that puts you in the right mindset to be able to really kind of do very well if you get into an interview situation. And the key thing I want to leave you with here is that precision really beats volume. So this isn't about pulling up a list of 30 hedge funds and applying to all of them. This is about finding a few select funds that you're interested in, doing your research, networking with people, connecting with people, finding out a lot more about what matters to them and how they think, and then positioning yourself accordingly. And if you do this right, then you'll start having conversations that matter. And when an opportunity does appear that you're suitable for, you'll be ready. So I tend to work with people on this exact process, on how to position yourself, how to navigate conversations, how to think about compensation, how to evaluate offers. And if it's something that you need support with, then feel free to reach out to me. All of my contact details will be in the description box. So yeah, I hope you found this useful. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add it here. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on the next video, where I'm going to be talking about getting into hedge funds when you're over 40.